Right. I'm gonna address the issue of motion sickness in virtual reality, and I hate to seem redundant. I'm sure you're all aware. Hi, Adam. You're all aware of the issue, but I wanna address this for a few different reasons. But um, it's not going to be a long talk, and I'm very happy to have any discussion with you just afterwards. But from the top then, my name is Alex. I'm the CEO of a Skövde-based game studio called Mostly Harmless Games. We released our first game, we self-published our first game on Steam earlier this year, a game called Funklift, which was a student project. And now we're working with virtual reality. We have different projects going on, and we're trying to go commercial with our first title called Munch. Munch is going to be available upstairs with VR Sweden in the demo booth, so if you want to try that out, feel free to. So I'll be talking about three different areas or topics around motion sickness. What causes it, what you can do as a developer to avoid it, and why I think the matter itself is kind of important. Just wave or something if the sound is off. Right. And like I said, I really don't want to seem dumb or redundant here. Obviously, motion sickness is a bad thing. It's the name itself, sickness, kind of gives it away. And a lot of you probably already know different techniques on how to avoid motion sickness in VR. But for me, it's important for two different reasons that we still discuss this. First of all, VR isn't new. This is a technique that's risen and crumbled for several generations. And I think that motion sickness has played a big part in the crumbling bit. And if we don't address and respect motion sickness as a real problem, I fear that this might happen again, because this is something that deters players simply. And other than that, I think that motion sickness is an issue of accessibility, and not respecting the issue itself means excluding players. And I'm kind of allergic to that. So my hopes here are to partially inform you, but also to engage you in the discussion itself. So the quick description of motion sickness as an illness would be dizziness caused by dissonance between what you see and what you feel. So there's something called the vestibular system, which is connected to your ear, and it detects acceleration and rotation of your head. And basically, this vestibular system must match with your visual perception and your physical movements. So if they don't match, for instance, if you're dizzy or you're moving, like in a vehicle or something, or you're intoxicated, your body or your brain is going to assume that something's wrong. And the natural reaction or the natural assumption is you're poisoned. And when you're poisoned, you want to get rid of the poison. That means your body's going to empty itself. So thanks, evolution. It's a good thing, really, but it can be kind of annoying. And now we have to work with this. In virtual reality, common causes of nausea will be things like a low frame rate or an irregular frame rate, even if it's very high. Faulty tracking, like if you lose tracking and your camera skips around, that can get really bad. Other types of lag, or just motion to photon latency, like you do something and the visual perception doesn't catch up immediately. When we work with VR applications for PC, we're kind of spoiled by the hardware. We have very high system requirements, meaning that we don't have to optimize as much, perhaps, because we can assume a quite high minimum system standard. But this isn't always the case, and regardless, we should remember to optimize our applications to make sure that we do have a set, locked, and high frame rate. As a developer, what can you do? Well, the first step is just understanding and respecting motion sickness as a real issue. Not only if you don't experience motion sickness yourselves or ever had, I'd go so far to say as that you should especially address and discuss the issue if you haven't experienced it yourself. It can be a very powerful sensation, and it can ruin the experience almost immediately for a lot of people. And I'm just going to go through an excerpt of different random and rather general and probably quite common techniques for avoiding motion sickness in different scenarios. So just to start off, locomotion is kind of a problem for a medium where treadmills aren't really the norm yet, and they aren't very comfortable either, I've heard. Um, Moving around in VR can be really tricky when you're still constrained to some kind of area, whether you're standing or you're doing room scale. And one locomotion technique which works excellent is teleportation, like in Survive or in Budget Cuts, which I think this is. It feels unnatural to teleport around, and it may even break immersion to some extent, but it's still predictable, it's intuitive, and it doesn't cause any involuntary camera movements. And it can be complemented with various techniques to make it even more efficient and a good way of moving around, basically. I think in Budget Cuts you get a sort of a preview or a portal where you can see where you'll end up, so you can plan your moves a bit. Right. Then there's the railroad locomotion. Everything is sort of in contrast when it comes to locomotion to just having a direct input controller like a keyboard or a what do you call it, a gamepad. But railroad locomotion is actually, it's not a bad idea, but it can be really dangerous. Basically, railroad locomotion is based on the camera moving on its own as you progress. So you don't control that, or you don't control it entirely. A few things to remember when working with railroad locomotion. I'm going to go through them here. Acceleration is really hard for the body to work with if it's not connected to, or if you don't actually perform them yourself. So if you do have different kinds of movements, as you would, you're going to have to think about what parts you accelerate and decelerate. If you have a constant speed, that means less vestibular dissonance. But accelerating and decelerating, and especially up and down, can be really straining. And that can trigger this dissonance that causes motion sickness. And we talk a bit about vection, which refers to the illusions of self-movement, even when there are none. So you have to be aware of vection in your scenes. Do you have a scene where a lot of things are moving around? For any reason, you could be standing still, and you can have a lot of objects or items, like for instance, a train moving right in front of you. That could cause this vection sensation and cause rather unnecessary motion sickness. If you railroad or in other applications as well, you want to make sure that the camera moves more in the direction where you look, or at least generally. If you look to the side while you move, you're going to have more pixels move in front of you, meaning more vection going on in your scene. Just the same principle as if you're in a car. I don't know if you get motion sick or if you've ever been motion sick, but if you're sitting in a car, one common tip is to look straight ahead, far off in the road at some kind of point of reference which is really far away. And that's the same principle. You want to give the player or the user an ability to look far ahead in your scene. I was going to mention something about this. Yeah, whatever. Camera yaw, like rotation along the horizontal axis or along the vertical axis, really. That can be really aggressive. Once again, the vection comes into play. Moving to the sides means all of the pixels in front of you are moving at the same time. And leading the player and tracking the head movements properly will have better results to this rather than rotating the entire player or user. And then finally, a static frame of reference has proved to help a lot. If you have like a heads-up display or a helmet, the inside of a helmet or a cockpit, whatever suits your VR application, that will help the player or the user get rid of some of the effects that can cause motion sickness. So I'm going to go ahead and do some shameless self-promotion. This is our game. This is Munch. It's an eat and grow game in standing in room scale VR. Basically, the player controls a small fish, namely Munch, and must help Munch grow by eating smaller fish and avoiding the bigger ones. And this is a print screen from a mixed reality video a guy made. Kind of fun. So he's holding the motion controller, Munch is attached to it, and he must eat the small fish and avoid the big ones. So I wanted to bring this up as an example of full tracking. All right, so full tracking is not an alternative to locomotion. I'm sort of switching here now. It's actually the absence of it. So provided your application can support it, full tracking is probably the friendliest approach to avoid motion sickness in VR. Basically, you just make sure that all of the movements are mapped one-to-one with a perfect ratio. Moving a meter to the left will move the camera a meter to the left in-game, or 1 unit. And the same goes with the controllers. That means that 100% correctly represented movements will eliminate any kind of dissonance between your vision and your motion. So that's one way of going at it. Those were just sort of my tooltips. And now that we've gone through those, I just want to mention why I think this is important. Like, once again, we can't deter users from VR. That's gonna undermine the entire market. I hope that these tips and my insight will have given you some kind of learning, but mostly I hope that we can keep this discussion alive and that we can consider it relevant, so we don't fall into old habits and ruin the potential of VR. Discussions regarding VR or motion sickness in VR can easily be swept away by almost fanatic evangelists, and they have a tendency to fail at realizing that their customers throwing up should be considered bad PR, basically. And that was sort of all I had. Do you have any questions for me? Yes? Usually, also the question was, does motion sickness sort of appear quickly, or at what pace it occurs in the user? I'm speaking mostly from experience, actually. I can barely sit on a swing without getting sick. Usually, this is something that comes on progressively over a period of time. The more aggressive the motions, like if you're in a car in a VR application, the longer it's going to take for the symptoms to appear. But what I've actually noticed was that I played a VR game which was fully tracked with some teleportation locomotion, and the tracking sort of lagged out a bit, and I had some frame skips, and the camera jumped around for a bit. I went from perfectly fine to ready to throw up in seconds. So you have to be careful at all times, and everything has to be optimized at all times. So the onset can be very rapid, actually. Any other questions? I shall thank you for listening, and thank you. And like I said, if you go to the third floor and you go to VR Sweden's demo booth, you can try out